All right.
Con.
Okay. I am delighted, really delighted to be introducing Dean Ireland. Dean worked with me at Egon Zehnder for many years, and he's based in Melbourne and is married to Marianne and a few beautiful kids. Dean, I've always respected Dean for what he does. He's one of the best in the business. He spent well over a decade in Egon Zehnder and was a senior partner there. And before that, he had a real job. So he was running some businesses and headed up strategy, I think, at some point, Dean, in GE during the heights of GE. And you know, I would say the firm at the time was very lucky to have him. And so Dean and I, was funny, in the last few months, ever since Dean left Egon Zehnder, we actually connected so much more than we did when we were actually colleagues together. Not that we didn't talk to each other, but it's funny how things happen. So I'm really delighted that he said yes to sharing his experiences with us today. So Dean, thank you very much for being here today. And let me hand the time over to you.
Thanks, Kokong and Peter, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this forum. These forums are usually a great encouragement, not just to everyone in them, but also the people you invite in. So it's lovely that you're so warm and inviting and inclusive with people. It's tremendous. Before I get into it, I just want to also just say an encouraging thing for all of us, because not GFC, but COVID's an interesting one, particularly if you're in Melbourne at the moment. It feels like we're getting in a smaller and smaller, tighter cage. But I probably, like many of you, have reflected on the period that we're going through, and my mind can't going back to precedents in history. After the Spanish flu, we had a thing called the Roaring Twenties. After World War II, we had a thing called the Boomers. After the GFC, we had, well, maybe it was a GFC bump, but we've all lived through the period that was post-GFC. And then, of course, that wonderful man from Bankstown, Mr. Keating, described a thing called the recession we had to have. And again, the resilience and the vibrance of the society that we live in has been proven time and again. And I think, you know, whilst it feels pretty dark for many businesses and people and a bit hopeless at the moment, I'm sure that there's still, the best is still in front of us as a society and a community and as individuals. Kokong's asked me just to speak about a couple of observations about transition. And so I'm going to talk a little bit at putting my hat on from working in the world of the dark corners of search. But what I wanted to do is just probably anchor a couple of points. One of this is that before you transition, it's usually very helpful that you get a chance to reflect on who you are or who you're meant to be. And I can remember coming out of high school and thinking it's a big wide world out there. I've got no idea about what I want to be. I don't even know why I'm doing this degree. I happen to pass it and I happen to find myself in this confluence of situation. I don't know who I am. So one of the joys or benefits of getting older is you do start to get a bit better at that. I don't think you ever fully accomplish it, and I'll explain why, but you get better at it. And so, of course, the thing to reflect on for all of us is that where are you at your best? Where is it that you find that, you know, you're in that sweet spot and things are starting to move in your direction and you're getting energy in that position? So as you reflect about transition, think less about title, less about company and those. I'm 6'5". You guys can't see me on this, but people would come in and often see me and say, I want to go into something bigger. And you know, Kokong, many of you may have met Kokong, but Kokong's not 6'5". But I remember my mother used to teach me, or used to say, good things come in smaller packages. And being 6'5", I got to tell you, big's not always better. So reflect on who you are, and where are you at your best. Size and scale is not necessarily the destination. So a couple of things on my own journey. I've worked at 5 places in my career. 4 of those places no longer exist. Two of them actually died while I was working in them. Hopefully I didn't participate or contribute to that, but they're no longer here. One place that I did work that is still alive is called Accenture. And I noticed not that recently, a couple of years ago, that they published a piece that looked at the ASX 100 companies and noted that in the last decade, 60% of those companies no longer exist. So chances are, if you don't get an exogenous shock like COVID happening in your community, which brings to the end what you were doing, chances are that the normal pattern of life, the change of the seasons, is probably going to mean that we were going to go through a few more transitions. And so understanding a couple of fundamentals about how to actually position yourself and actually embrace what's the future is just acknowledging that this is just the normal ebb and flow of a career and of a life. So I have, I've had 15 years, as Kokong said, in the executive search world. I was trying to work out how many conversations I've had. I've had about, let's say 20,000 plus conversations during that period when I do the math and think about those conversations. So here's a few things that I've observed along the way. First is that people often come in, and they come into Kokong as well and say, how's the market? I wanted to get a feel for the market. And it still does just blow my head, because I'd sit there and I go, the first thing to acknowledge about jobs and positions, it's not a market. A market implies that there's a clearinghouse, that there's a place where buyers and sellers come together. There is an exchange of information. There is a visibility, a transparency, and a deal is done, a match is made, good things happen, and we all wander off away from the market and go and do our things. The job market is as imperfect as it possibly can. There is no transparency. There is imperfect knowledge everywhere. And there is no central calling place. I like to say to people, it's more of a jungle than a market. And it's a jungle because it requires you, the individual, to explore it. It requires you to look at a tree and say, that's a tree, but I don't know what's behind it. You need to actually go and venture in what's behind it. So the first thing is, as you're looking to transition, is to acknowledge, first of all, it's a jungle, it ain't a market. And that means that there's obligations on you as you step into that, which go well beyond Kokong, I'm in your presence, so therefore help me find a job. It just doesn't work like that. Some of you have already worked that out. I'm going to go back also to another little lesson that I learned, and I learned it actually in GE. So GE 25 years ago had this wonderful progressive group called the GE Women's Network. And they insisted that I went along. Now, it wasn't just me. They also insisted that every other bloke went along. And I was going, well, hang on, I don't qualify. There's a W in this network that you've established, and I don't fit the W. And they insisted that we went along. And so even 25 years ago, there were some things that GE wasn't progressive about, but on this thing, it was extremely progressive. And I remember one particular session, not unlike this, where someone got up and talked about how do you manage your career. And they talked about, if it's in GE, one thing GE was very famous for is 3-letter acronyms. They perfected them. They were better than anyone else that I've ever seen in my life at about a 3-letter acronym. So they had this 3-letter acronym called the PI model, and it was the PI model of your career. And so they said, listen, there's 3 ingredients you need to make sure you're always reflecting on for you to progress or have opportunities open up to you. And it's the PI model. So the first letter in the PI is performance. You've got to perform. You've got to do your job well, and you've got to actually deliver the goods. Now, if you're talking to an external person, they're not going to know what that is. All right. So you need to reflect on what is it that I actually represent, I've achieved, and package it up in a way that your audience can understand it, because they're going to have a different language wherever you go. The second one was initiative, and that was basically to say, don't just look at your patch, look at actually how you be helpful. Now, I'd love you to reflect on that, because you're not in a patch at the moment. Some of you are actually looking to transition, but how do you be helpful to people beyond or externally that you're reaching at? And there's something for you to reflect on and learn on, and we'll come back to that. And the last part, which I'm going to probably talk a little bit more around, was the E in the pie, which was exposure. So you can be the best performer with the greatest initiative. And if no one knows anything about it, guess what? You're back in the jungle. You're like behind one of those trees and I cannot see you. All right. So you've got to lift your exposure. All right. And in fact, GE at those days used to say, well, actually, for the women in the room, that's probably the thing that you're the least, the guys beat you at this. Like they will tell me how good you are, how good they are. You girls probably would say, no, I'll let my results do the work. Okay. But they'd say, actually, no, there's something about exposure that we all need to learn and actually how to build networks so that we can build it. So GE used to break down, this was the way to actually progress or have opportunities open up to you. So what I'm going to tackle on is I'm going to talk about the exposure piece here. So this is the other lesson. So I'm calling it my 100 coffees, my strategy to building exposure. So I'm going to tell you two stories of two executives that have impressed me. There's been lots of executives, lots of people that have impressed me, but these two particular, and I'm going to sort of use their names. So they don't know that I'm using their names, but I'm happy to tell them, and I'm probably going to say good things about them. So if it does get back to them, a blessing to them, I guess. So the first one is David, and I won't use his surname, I'll just call him David W, but I'll use the companies he's with. So David's a bright fellow, a little bit on the introverted side, so thoughtful, not easy to actually get past the first meeting and the veneer with him. But he was a bright fellow, studied overseas, came back and worked with one of the big consulting firms, hated it, desired to climb the corporate ladder, and he joined the big B, BHP. And they put him into a transformation area. And he worked very hard in that area, but I don't know if any of you have ever worked in a transformation area. It's kind of like the living dead, you know, it's a real zombie world to be involved in. It's not a career, okay? Some of you might actually want to take umbrage at that, but that's my experience of them, having also done some of these as well. So he worked really hard, worked through the pie model. He didn't call it the pie model in there, but that's what he was doing. And they gave him the most flea-bitten, difficult mine in the back blocks of Queensland, a coal mine. And he went out there with his wife and he loved it, okay? And he worked there and he was very diligent, but he was not a hairy-knuckled, with all due respect to the miners on this call, he wasn't a hairy-knuckled, fire-breathing, coal-eating coal miner thing. He was a very intellectual fellow and a very bright one. But he went and ran it and he loved it, okay? Restructure happens in the business. Now, guess what? Every 3 years there's going to be a restructure, whether you are, you just got to acknowledge it. There will be. Restructuring the business, he lost his sponsor and he lost his job. He trundled back to Melbourne, came and saw us. Now, I knew this guy's story extremely well. I liked him a lot. I thought he was very bright. I could see that, you know, there was someone who was going to love him in his organisation. And I said, listen, David, I'd love to help you, but I can't. There's no coal mines down here anymore. Okay, and there's the sort of work that you've been doing, it's hard to sort of see how I could slot you in. So David comes back to me one day and he's landed a job with a software business called MYOB. Some of you probably have had exposure to it. It's an accounting software. It's an incredibly valuable product. It was actually started down here in Melbourne and it's been wonderfully spectacular stock. It's actually in the hands of private equity today. And he's on the executive suite of MYOB. And I said to him, David, I'm a reasonably creative guy. I like a bit of random in my life, as my daughter calls it. I said, in a million years, if I got that mandate from a search consultant, I'd never have thought of you. I wouldn't have put the strings together and say, you should be on the executive suite of the C-suite of MYOB. And in fact, he was heading products, which was basically the product redevelopment of MYOB's core product onto the cloud. I said, I don't remember any of this in the conversation. And this is an extremely senior role in Melbourne. How did you get it? And he said to me, well, it was 100 coffees. And he said, I wasn't actually looking for it. What I was looking to do is to connect with people and learn from them. And as I went on that journey, I found myself in the clutches of one of the directors of MYOB who I'd met through my journey. And I was actually seeking his view on something completely different. And in the meeting, a light bulb went on and he said, you know what, your core skills, your performance actually fits the nature of what we're trying to do on the role. So rather than getting a teenager out of hacking school to come and actually build this for me, I'm going to go for this coal miner who's actually going to do it. So 5 years later, private equity's taken them out yet again, and he doesn't need to work. He will. But that's just an example of it. The other chap I'll just touch on is a guy called Mo. So Mo, another very talented fellow, worked in telco, worked in New Zealand. He was actually family immigrated from a part of South Asia that was actually in a civil war. And the war got his parents were on the wrong side of that war. They came to Australia and then to New Zealand as immigrants. And he got a job in telco, and he was basically selling handsets. Got a job in an industry I'm not particularly thrilled with, but many in our society are, and that was in gambling. And he rose to be in the executive suite of a gambling company. Now, for those of you in gambling, I understand it because plenty in society want it. But what you should also realise is a lot of people that won't employ you if you've worked in gambling. They actually see it as a stain on you, a little bit like tobacco. With all due respect for people that enjoy tobacco as well. So Mo comes and sees me, and what's happened is there's been some merger and changes in the underlying market of the gambling industry in Australia. And so basically this executive team has been disbanded. They no longer have a job. They've been made redundant. He wants a job. Mo, you're a very engaging fellow. You're incredibly bright. You're great on consumer products. I think very highly of you. I think your values are lovely, despite the gambling bit. I want to help you. Anyway, he comes back to me a while back. I didn't have anything that was coming onto my radar. And he's landed a job working in the Internet of Things, automating the grid, the electrical grids for across Asia and in Australia for a product that's come out of Monash University. And again, I've gone, Mo, I'm a creative guy. I don't understand how the hell this job happened. How did you get this role? And again, 100 copies, Dean, I did a spreadsheet, and everyone that I met, I wrote down beside them, what did I learn? And some of it, I heard names of people. I said, mostly people actually are pretty open and they will listen to your story. There's a few that won't, but most will. And he said, so I just went on a journey. And he said, and in the end, I started really enjoying it. But I also found myself in the clutches of Macquarie Bank. And in that conversation, they said, oh, we've got this business that's been spun out of Monash University. Management's not working. We'll change them out. Why don't you come in and run it, Mo? So the next thing, he's in the energy sector selling Internet of Things to enable transmission grids to be looked at remotely. And I'm going, Mo, I could not have come up with that in a million years for you, as much as I respect you. So I just say that to encourage you, particularly on the E of the pie model. So look, a couple of things to think about. How do you actually build out that fountain? If you can think about that transition, I'd love you to have in your mind an image of a fountain. And in that fountain, you're pouring water into the top and it's cascading over. Now, the first level is basically the industry that you're in, okay? So who are the competitors? Who are the service providers in there? Then you start looking at adjacent areas. Well, who are the customers that are dealing with? And then you start getting completely random when you get down towards the bottom of the cascade. Your role when you're in a transition is you need to have 100 coffees and you need to get a fountain working for you. And that's a journey of exploration. And I'd encourage you, if you're not already, get yourself a spreadsheet or just have a simple list or a list of paper of some sort and start writing down ideas that come into your head, both of industries, companies, and people you would like to meet and just connect with. So the last thing I'm going to touch on, and I'm probably talking too much, Kokong, so I've lost track of the time. How are we going?
You're going, so keep going, mate.
Keep going. All right. So the last thing is, I'm going to just give you a tip about when you engage with someone in a search firm. Okay, number one is don't ask them how the market is. It's not a market. It's a jungle, all right? Number two is don't use it as the opportunity to unload your CV on everything you've ever done in it, okay? Remember, they're human, okay? So you need to think about what are the things or the impressions that I do want to leave with them that are memorable. Now, if you're as human as I am, that means you've got 5 fingers. The maximum that I can remember on an impression that you meet with someone is going to be about 5 things. In fact, it's less than that. It might be 3. So you need to think about what is it that I want to leave that's distinctive about me. Whatever you do, don't use the word transformation and don't use the word market. All right? Everybody uses those words. Okay, they are not distinctive. at all. Right? You need to think about what your unique character, journey, proposition might be that you'll be able to communicate across them. The second thing is about them being human. Ask them how you might be able to help them. Listen, where are you operating or something at the moment? Is there a way that I can help you? All right. Find out a bit about what's on their mind. So when you see a search firm, probably I had this experience just recently, and I'm not actually active at the moment, but this individual spent the next 45 minutes telling me about every minutiae in their career, etc. Which I just couldn't even ask them a question in the end. And in the end, I thought, boy, you've left me an impression, and that is you cannot listen, which is a terrible impression to leave anyone. So have a human interaction with not just the search firm if you happen to be with them, but with others. Ask them a bit about what's going on there, what are their interests, etc. So the last part, which you guys and girls are already doing extremely well, and that is find some buddies. So there's a very old proverb, I think, about steel sharpens steel, so does one person sharpen the other. And so, use forums like this to actually get yourself encouraged, because there's times when you won't be feeling encouraged, but to basically, go back into the fray, or to take a risk, or to venture out and push the parameters, or to explore something that you thought, look, that's not on the grid for me. Those groups can come out through lots of different social environments. The key is for you, as you're on your journey, is actually find a couple of areas where actually you can feel that you can get encouraged, built up, get a sense of daring do about your journey that you're on, and some enthusiasm about where you go. Because if I come back to where we started, after the flu pandemic in 1990, we had a thing called the Roaring Twenties. After Paul Keating's recession we've had the longest growth of any Western country in the last 500 years consecutive. So the sun will come up from this COVID period for all of us, and it'll be a good time, and it'll be a good place for us all. I think I might rest it on that, Kokon.
That's great. Thank you, Dean. Peter, we can stop recording now.